As we continue our study of 1 Samuel 28 today, today's passage is really kind of fitting because it deals with, as you can see, a witch, a medium. And with yesterday being Halloween, I thought this would be an appropriate place for us to park for a little bit today. And I want to start by talking about desperation. I think all of you would agree with me that desperate time calls for desperate measures, right? At least that's how I felt a few years ago when Sam locked me out of the house. Sam is here with us this morning, and we talked a little bit about this. I asked if he remembered locking me out of the house, and he said, nope, I don't. He was about 2 at the time. And when he did this, it was a cold winter morning. Krista had already left for work. Sam was inside eating a snack, and I was out back trying to get our dog, Caspian, into the house. But Caspian was being particularly difficult this morning, so it took a few minutes to corral him to the back door. Finally, after a few good bribes, he loves cheese more than anything in the world, so I finally got him to get to the door with the bribe of cheese. We get to the door, and I start to turn the knob, and I discover that it has been locked somehow. It was really a perplexing scenario. I was certain that I hadn't locked the door at the time. Krista was gone, so she couldn't have done it. And as I said, Sam was a toddler at the time. How could a toddler possibly have locked the door? Was it even possible? I've seen him trying to open doors before, but I'd never seen him attempt to lock one. You can hear him laughing in the back there. Thanks for locking me outside, kiddo. Sure enough, while I was outside with Caspian, Sam was inside playing with the doorknob, and he finally found the locking mechanism and was able to lock it. No big deal, I thought to myself. I'll just go and find the hide-a-key, which we had hidden in one of our window wells. But here's the thing. We had loaned that hide-a-key to one of our family members earlier in the year, and someone forgot to put it back. It's that moment that utter panic began to set in. What was I going to do? I was outside in the cold. I was without a jacket. Sorry, Mom, I didn't take a jacket out into the cold. I thought I was only going to be outside for a few seconds. Sam, the toddler, was inside alone. Krista and my mom both had house keys, and I could have called either one of them to get them to bring me a house key, but my phone was inside of the house. I started to weigh every possible option, including breaking into my own home. Pulled the ladder out, started checking all of our windows to see if by chance any of them had been left open. Nope. The thought of breaking a window was my next solution. I was that desperate, and desperate times call for desperate measures, right? By the way that I solved that particular solution, I had just gotten my Apple Watch and realized that I could just call my mom from my watch. So I was panicking for no reason. She was actually already on the way to the house to pick up Sam. No problem. But what about a bigger problem in life? I'm sure that you have experienced a similar sense of desperation at some point, the feeling of pure hopelessness or fear that so often leads to rash decisions. My guess is that some of you are even feeling that way right now. We are, after all, living in desperate times. Life is filled with desperate occasions. Life cycles itself through various seasons of dreadful, dreary desperation. I think 2020 has felt like a particularly desperate kind of year. COVID's been hard enough, but when you add in all of the political, economic, and social unrest, I, as a pastor, begin to get the sense that our entire country, every single person is living their lives on the edge of a knife, and that people are at the point that they're willing to do just about anything to ease themselves out of the tension that they're experiencing. As Christians, we like to think that we're really good at turning to God in those times of crisis. But the reality is, crisis has a way of causing us to seek relief in other places. I think we do this because we know that God doesn't always automatically remove us from the trials of this life. In fact, God sometimes keeps us within our trials to form character, to make us into better people, and we don't like that. We don't like that. Culturally, we are so impatient. We want quick solutions and easy answers. We want to feel good now, not at some undetermined point in the future. So, we, even those of us who are faithful believers, seek comfort in nearly anything other than God, so long as it gives us that hit of dopamine, so long as it makes us feel good in the instant. Consider the fact that alcohol sales skyrocketed during the lockdown. Consider the fact that traffic to a lot of porn sites boomed during the lockdown. Consider the fact that retailers like Amazon smashed earning expectations during the lockdown. To be sure, circumstances felt desperate, so people turned to all kinds of things to make themselves feel better. I'm not making a judgment call on those things. I'm simply pointing out the fact that we all wanted answers, we all wanted solutions, and so we went everywhere. We went anywhere to find comfort. And that's precisely the kind of scenario that Saul finds himself in as we picked up in 1 Samuel 28. But before we read the text itself, I have to tell you that I personally love this passage. It's one of my favorite passages in all of 1 Samuel. Not only is Saul incredibly relatable here, not only can we relate to his problems and how he addressed his problems, but it's one of the places in the Bible where we get a legitimate glimpse into the supernatural world. A world that exists beyond what we can see here and now tangibly. And for those of you who are Star Wars fans, there's also a reference to Endor here in this passage, which is kind of a fun little thing. The witch that Saul goes and addresses lives in a town called Endor, which is the forest moon of the Ewoks, right? With that said, let's turn to God's word. We're going to be reading 1 Samuel 28, verses 3 through 25 today. Hear the word of God. Now Samuel had died, and all of Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. Saul expelled the mediums and the wizards from the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. When Saul inquired of the Lord didn't answer him, not by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her." His servants said to him, "There is a medium at Endor." So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes and went there, and he with 2 men went. They came to the woman by night, and he said, "Consult a spirit for me, and bring up for me the one whom I name to you." The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the wizards from the land. Why then are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death?" But Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He answered, "Bring up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Have no fear. What do you see?" The woman said to Saul, "I see a divine being coming up out of the ground." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" She said, "An old man coming up. He is wrapped in a robe." So Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground. And then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have summoned you to tell me what I should do." Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and has become your enemy? The Lord has done to you just as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you today. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your son shall be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. The woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, "Your servant has listened to you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now, therefore, you also listen to your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you. Eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he got up from the ground and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fat calf in the house. She quickly slaughtered it and took flour, kneaded it, and baked unleavened cakes. She put them before Saul and his servants, and they ate. And then they rose and went away that night. I want you to pay really close attention to what's going on at the beginning of this passage, contextually. We're told that the Philistines had gone to war with Israel once again. I think the army had to have been massive because we're told that when Saul saw the army, he was afraid and his heart trembled greatly. But that wasn't even the scariest part of the entire situation. The scariest part is what we read in verse 6 and is repeated later on in that chapter. Even though Saul sought God's guidance, this is really the first time that he's done so. We know that he's at the end of his rope. Saul, this person who's ignored God up to this point, comes to God and says, "God, where are you? What are you going to do to save me?" He gets no response from God. And it's not hard to understand or imagine how Saul was feeling at that point. He was outmatched by the Philistine army. He was directionless spiritually. Not only had God left him, not only did God not offer him guidance, but Samuel was dead as well. His human contact to God was gone. And in his pursuit of David, one of the things that Saul had done was he had killed so many of the prophets and priests of Israel. He really was without any kind of spiritual direction. And so as he sees the Philistine forces muster, he begins to feel that tug of hopeless desperation. And like so many of us, he would do whatever it would take to resolve that tension. Thus, in a desperate move, Saul asked his servants to help him locate a medium or a necromancer who could communicate with the dead, specifically with the spirit of Samuel. We can almost hear the thought process in Saul's mind. We can see the wheels turning. It's as though he's saying, if I can just talk to Samuel one more time, then certainly I can find a way out of this mess. And even though Saul's desire to find a way forward, to find a path forward is understandable, we have to recognize just how misguided he was in this attempt. A medium and whatever magical powers she did or didn't have certainly weren't the way forward. You see, in verses 3 and 9, we're told that Saul had actually previously banned mediums and wizards from Israel. By contacting this medium, Saul violated the very policy that he himself had created. Of course, the policy was a good thing. God had repeatedly told the people of Israel to reject all things tied to the occult. This is really an aspect of Israel's worldview that separated them from other nations in the ancient Near East. The ancient Near East is that portion of land where Israel lived. One commentator says it like this: Israel's ban of magic was unique, and it made it different and distinct from all of the other nations that surrounded it. All other nations in the ancient Near East believed in and practiced a wide variety of magical arts. They believed formulaic recitations and imitative acts could manipulate and exploit the powers of the deities and thereby procure benefits for themselves that were otherwise impossible. By implication, the gods were viewed as subservient to supernatural forces beyond their control. Israel's monotheism and concepts of transcendence and sovereignty of Yahweh made such views an impossibility. The Creator God is not subservient to any manner of supernatural force beyond his control and cannot be manipulated under any circumstances. Israel's theology simply made the use of magic forbidden. That's the first thing that I want you to note from this quote. Magic in this time was used to manipulate the gods. God banned Israel from practicing magic because he didn't want them to likewise think that he could be manipulated through the recitation of simple formulaic words. But there's another part of this quote that's important. It goes on to say, significantly, however, the Old Testament's ban on magic is not based on the assertion that magic is ineffective. On the contrary, magic is banned precisely because it does work. Saul was absolutely correct to ban magicians and sorcerers from Israel. their very real and very evil powers could have easily drawn the people of Israel away from God. The fact that Saul turned to a medium during his time of need tells us everything we need to know about the state of his relationship with God. And obviously, over the course of the past several weeks, we've watched Saul's relationship with God decline in some very tragic ways. But here in 1 Samuel 28, we see just how far it has declined. That is, Saul had reached the end of his rope and was actually trying to use magic to manipulate God in his own favor. And that was a new low even for Saul. That was a new low even for Saul. Now, there's really a lot that can be unpacked from this passage. For me, one of the main takeaways is that this passage really does point to the reality of a supernatural world, the reality of a world that exists beyond what you and I can see physically, that we can see tangibly. I often tell you the kinds of questions that people come to me to ask, and one of the most frequent questions that people ask me is whether or not I believe ghosts exist. People ask that for one reason or another all the time. And this is one of the passages, if not the only passage in the Bible that might, and I want to stress might, indicate that they do exist. But more importantly than that, it's also a passage that clearly shows the dangers of interacting with such entities and such realities. Now, I'm guessing, and I think this is a fair guess. I think this is an informed guess. Most of you aren't going to try to use actual magic to manipulate God, nor are you going to attempt to communicate with the dead, whether it's through a Ouija board or mediums exist today, whether or not you know it. My guess is you're not going to try to do that. But I think we do need to be aware that there are some people in our world that do engage in these kinds of practices. There's no doubt that people living in the 21st century have a hunger and a desire to experience the supernatural. Unfortunately, though, I feel that Christians have been slow to meet that need. So what's happened in the past 20 years is the New Age movement has come in, and it's rushed to fill the gap with beliefs in things like channeling and crystals and horoscopes, paranormal psychology, and even a concept of reincarnation. Which, again, I've said this before, I'll say it again. As Christians, we don't believe in reincarnation. We believe in resurrection, which are two completely different things. You see, in 1 Samuel 28, Saul represents a paradigm of the kind of individual who turns away from legitimate sources of relating to God and relies instead on illicit ways of manipulating God through magic. And that's really what the New Age movement tries to do. It tries to offer our culture an array of services that will help them find fulfillment in one way or another, to find meaning and purpose, to make life turn out how they want it to turn out. And we Christians need to be consistent in condemning all uses of magic as tools for manipulating God. But how far do we go in pushing back against things that have an apparent association to magic, an apparent association to the occult? Should we refuse to participate in Halloween? I have to tell you that Chris and I grew up in very different households in this regard. Our family did not participate in Halloween whatsoever, and that was a theological decision. Your family might make that decision, and that's a call you have to make as a family. But in my family, we went all out for Halloween. In fact, I was going to haunted houses when I was like 3 years old. That's not true, but we participated in a lot of Halloween activities. Do we try to ban things like the Harry Potter books? I think this kind of attitude is really common among a lot of Christian circles. Halloween is related, at least seemingly so, to the very things that the Bible condemns so clearly: magic and sorcery and the occult. As such, believers should avoid it as well as anything else that deals with those things. Harry Potter. Yesterday, which was obviously Halloween, which, as I mentioned, makes today's message especially fitting, I spent some time revising what I had written prior in the week, and as I was doing that, A memory of something that happened to our niece Ella came to my mind when she was in elementary school. This happened a few years ago. There was a boy in her class that told her, "You are going to hell for going trick-or-treating." And he was dead serious about it. While I understand that concern, and while I agree that there are certain aspects of Halloween that are too dark, certain things in the media that are too evil, I also feel that these concerns miss out on why it is that the Bible condemns magic in the first place. It was condemned first and foremost because people use it to try to manipulate their gods, and there was always the possibility that we, the people of Yahweh, would try to use it to manipulate our God, to do our bidding, especially in the midst of desperate circumstances. Here's something that I want you to take away. Nobody is going to hell for trick-or-treating. Nobody is going to hell for just reading the Sorcerer's Stone. But someone who spends their entire life attempting to get God to serve them, that individual might very well end up eternally separated from God. So I was getting ready this morning, reading through my sermon again, I thought of a C.S. Lewis quote that I wanted to share with you. C.S. Lewis said this one time: "There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, 'Thy will be done,' and those to whom God says in the end, 'Thy will be done.' All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. Those who knock, it is opened." You see, what I'm getting at this morning is the fact that literal magic shouldn't be as much of a concern for us. We need to focus on the ways in which we try to manipulate our God to do our bidding through other, much more subtle means. As another commentator says, it would be simplistic for us to limit the application of 1 Samuel 28 to blatant heretical practices such as the occult and magical incantations. Rather, we should also consider how easy it is to use the good things that we have in a magical way in an attempt to manipulate God. For example, consider the magical use of prayer, church attendance, and tithing among modern believers. Saul's reliance on non-biblical worldview needs to be applied in such cases in which perfunctory observance of the standard means of grace can come to represent the means by which we exact God's good favor. In other words, some believers come to expect good things from God, even believe that God owes them something because we have fulfilled certain obligations. One's relationship with God can be quickly reduced to a sort of previously arranged agreement, a sort of quid pro quo in which all we have to do is keep our end of the bargain and God will be forced to keep his. If you don't agree with this statement, I want you to honestly reflect on the last time you prayed to God in the middle of a crisis. What kinds of things did you say to God? I guess I can't assume that you tried to manipulate God through your words, but I know that I definitely have. A family member got sick. God, if you heal him, I will serve you with a passion that I have never served you with before in my life. My bank account looks like it's about to run dry. God, if you help me make it to the next payday, I promise that I will tithe just a little bit extra. Sam locked himself out of the house. God, if you help me fix this situation, I promise I'll have more faith in the future. Quid pro quo. You give me this, I'll give you this. We'll exchange goods and we'll be good. Of course, we should pray to God in moments of crisis. That's not what I'm saying. Prayer itself isn't the issue. The issue is that we often view such moments as occasions to manipulate God, to bargain with God, to give God whatever small gift, whatever small token we have as a means of purchasing his favor and getting him to give us whatever we want in return. And prayer in particular has the potential to become nothing more than a hollow means to an end. An empty incantation instead of a means of expressing our love for, our adoration of, and thanks to God. At the end of the day, such abuses are just as misguided as Saul's trip to Endor. Thus, the next time you find yourself in a crisis, because you will, I will, life is full of crisis moments. The next time you find yourself in desperate times, you will, I will. Life is full of desperate moments. I want to encourage you to not turn to desperate measures in order to manipulate God. Simply trust that God will guide you through whatever it is that you're facing, because He's a God who loves you. He's a God who cares about you. He's a God who wants to know your fears, God who wants to know your concerns. Had Saul simply started building his relationship with God, the tragedy of his life would have been prevented, but he didn't. Instead, he relied on his own strength. Instead, he relied on magic. And as we'll see in a few weeks, all of these attempts utterly failed him. And the tragedy of his life will end with a tragic death. Trust God. God will guide you through whatever problem you are facing. Go to Him first and foremost. God loves you. God will guide you to a better future.